Hello and welcome to the November 2015 DIBBLE webinar. Greetings to everyone who's here. We're thrilled to have you. This is Kaye Reed, the Executive Director of the DIBBLE Institute. Oops. This is Kaye Reed, the Executive Director of the DIBBLE Institute, and I'd like to introduce to you Kathy Guidry. Kathy, say hi.
Hi, good afternoon. Glad to be here.
So Kathy is our engineer. She's on the DIBBLE staff and our very capable engineer. And we also have Kelleen Kaye, a Senior Director of Research at the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy. Hi, Kelleen.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you.
Great. So how many of you, can we have a quick show of hands, how many of you are new to a DIBBLE webinar today? How many for you are this is your first DIBBLE webinar? One of you, two of you, three of you. Okay, so most of you are repeaters. Well, thank you for coming back and back and back. That's what we hope is having this regular webinar. We're able to provide professional development in the field of youth relationship education. So I'm thrilled to have you back, and welcome to our newcomers. Thanks very much. Let me give you just a little bit of information about the webinar. You're mostly, I think, all coming through, the sound's coming through your computers, but if that doesn't work for you, in your invitation is this phone number and code in case you need to dial in, but it looks like most people are successfully on. And also, we will be archiving this webinar, as we do all our webinars, on our website in a couple of days, and we'll send you a notice when that is there so you have access to it and you can share it with colleagues, which we're thrilled if you do. I want to introduce you to two important people in the life of the DIBBLE Institute. This is Helen and Charlie DIBBLE, our founders. They started this work about 20 years ago. Charlie was an engineer by trade, so a straight ahead kind of fix-it kind of guy. And when he saw how relationships, and mostly intimate relationships between parents or with young people themselves, how young people would often get tripped up by their own relationships, or children's outcomes would start to decline if their parents were in some kind of turmoil. He decided, again, Mr. Engineer, that he could fix this. So about 20 years ago, he asked the leading people in the field of, at that time, what they knew about creating long-lasting, strong, and stable families. And the work was just beginning, and they could share a lot with him. But when he asked them, "What are you doing to convey this to young people?" they, shrugged their shoulders and said, "Well, we really, nothing much. Reaching young people is hard work." So Charlie brought 6 of us around his dining room table. I was privileged to be one of them, and said, "I have a dream. I have a dream that every young person in America will have access to relationship skills education before, while they're in high school or even as young adults." So now here we are 20 years later. We just did some statistics for a report we're putting together, and we're thrilled to say that in the last 10 years, since 2006, we conservatively estimate that DIBBLE programs have been taught to 1.5 million young people around the United States. That's all 50 states plus Puerto Rico and 3 foreign countries. So we're thrilled because everybody who's on this webinar and other people out there in the world, you are on our team to get this relationship skills materials out into the world. So we thank you. Charlie passed away many years ago, but we know that he would be appreciative of your efforts as well. So thank you. Big round of applause to everybody who's doing the good work. So the DIBBLE Institute, independent, research-based nonprofit. We're a national organization, and like I said before, reaching a ton of kids, thanks to our partners like you all, people who use our materials in the field. So let me just, for those of you who are new, let me just reiterate or tell you what our core values are at DIBBLE. One is we believe in research. Wherever the research leads us, we may not be comfortable with that research initially, but we go to where the research leads. And One good example of that is 10, 15, even 20 years ago, all cohabitation was seen as really risky behaviors. Living together before marriage was seen as really risky. And subsequent to that, there's been much more nuanced research that shows there's some cohabitation that is less risky than others. So, and Kelleen will be going over part of this, but if you're living together and you have a clear plan for a future together, and you really see that clearly and had those discussions, it's not as risky as if you just slide into that relationship. So everything we do, translating research into teaching tools, is based on the premise that that research is key to all this. The second thing we believe in, and apologies for the pixelated slide there, but we believe, while we believe in stable, healthy families, helping people form stable, healthy families, we also understand that not every family is like that. And we know that there's thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of single parents who every day are doing heroic work with their children, heroic work. It's really hard to raise children, and it's even harder if you're doing it on your own. So this means, by means, no disrespect to people who are raising children by themselves. But even they would say, and I've read many articles like this, where they look at their lives and say, if I had to do it over again, or what I wish for my children, I wish I had had a partner to help with this. I wish I had had a spouse. It would have made it easier. So we mean no disrespect to single parents. They do heroic work, but even they will often admit that they wish it was different. We also recognize that we know that high conflict, abusive relationships must not be tolerated. Abusive of self, of others, of substances. So this does not mean we're not a fan of people staying together in a family unit regardless of the situation. There's certainly clearly indicators where it's best for children and best for the adults involved if that partnership dissolves. But that said, there's oftentimes, often the impact of divorce or never married parenting on children can be seen when parents just kind of drift away into a young person. They don't see that turmoil. They don't see what caused their parents to split. And for them, it can be very devastating. And we have other webinars that you can look back on where we talk about the impact of divorce on children. So we believe in healthy, stable families, but we want those to be, safe for children. And we also realize that there's circumstances where we don't want those families to continue. And lastly, we believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect. We mean that in terms of sexual identity. So our materials, we write them so they serve diverse audiences. We have materials that have gay and lesbian scenarios in them because we believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect and all relationships can be made better with relationship skills. So our materials cover quite a wide range, but people always ask that, wondering if we have a stand, and that is our core value on that. So today I have the pleasure to welcome Kelleen Kaye to our broadcast. Kelleen is the Senior Director of Research at the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy. This report is about a year old, but it's still very fresh information because we often look at the high number of children born to unmarried parents, and we kind of shrug our shoulders, or we say that's the way it is, or it doesn't matter, or it matters. I mean, there's all kinds of folklore around this. But what Kelleen and her team did was to really look at the data and really help us understand, open up the hood and look under the hood and see what's going on in terms of this, both in terms of the pros and the cons of delayed marriage in America. So Kelleen, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Kaye, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present findings from our report. This is a report that was written by Kaye Heimowitz, Jason Carroll, Brad Wilcox, and myself. And like Kaye said, we really just kind of wanted to look under the hood in terms of what's going on with these trends and what the implications might be. So before diving in, I did want to say just a bit about why we took on this project. I'm obviously with the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy. We are not the national campaign to promote marriage. In fact, a lot of our efforts focus much more on helping young adults take steps to avoid getting pregnant until they're intending to. So we focus a lot on education and a lot on contraceptive services and many other approaches as well. But we also know that sex, pregnancy, and parenthood happens within the context of a relationship. And as marriage occurs at a later and later age, young people are left with a longer and longer period of their lives when they are trying to not get pregnant, or in many cases, maybe caught in this messy period of ambivalence when they're trying to figure things out and they're just not quite sure where their path is headed. So this half of the equation, the relationship half of the equation, is very important to us in our work. It's also the case that part of our goal here at the campaign is to dive into stories we feel just haven't been fully told, to highlight important findings, spark conversations, maybe challenge conventional wisdom a bit, and raise important questions. We had been finding in our travels that on the one hand, there were a good many policymakers and thought leaders who weren't even aware of just how far marriage had receded toward the horizon, or at least they hadn't fully contemplated what the implications of that were. Well, on the other hand, there was also a narrative playing out in the media and pop culture saying that, in fact, marriage among young adults was already dead and buried. And we were pretty sure that that wasn't the case either. So our goal in this report isn't so much to say that all 20-somethings should run out and get married, especially not the youngest 20-somethings, but to say, you know, hey, where are these trends headed? What are the implications? Do we care? And if so, what should we do about it? So as Kaye said, to look under the hood a bit. Next slide, please. So about those trends, the fact is that marriage has been receding for years, and this isn't exactly breaking news. We see in this chart the age at which women first get married has advanced from 21 years of age in 1970 to 27 years of age in 2011. And it's not too different for men. It moved, I believe, from age 23 to 29 over the same period. Another way to look at the advancing age of marriage is to look at the percentage of women who haven't yet married. So in 1970, 36% of women hadn't yet gotten married by age 20 to 24. And only 11% were still unmarried by age 25 to 29. We see that in the white and red bar next to the 1970. Now by 2010, this had risen considerably. We see that 79% of 20 to 24-year-old women were still unmarried. And 48% of 25 to 29-year-old women had not married. And like I said, here I'm showing trends for women, but the changes for men were somewhat similar. Next slide, please. That's not to say this delay is all bad. And we're certainly not, again, advocating that very young adults should run out and get married. You know, women in particular tend to benefit by marrying a bit later, especially in terms of their economic well-being. And there are a lot of different studies that show this. Here's one particular cut at the data. We found that for women with a high school diploma or some college, those who delayed marriage earned about $4,000 a year more. And among those with a college degree, those who delayed marriage earned about $18,000 a year more. Now, we're not suggesting that this is all causal or the result or the direct result of age at first marriage. You know, our estimates control for some basic demographic characteristics, but of course we can't control for everything. Even so, it only makes sense that finishing one's education and getting started on an employment path before getting married can be beneficial. Now, as many probably know, the delayed marriage premium does not quite so much hold true for young men. They did experience a premium by delaying marriage at least to age 20, but beyond that premium, or I should say that premium generally didn't hold up for postponing marriage until even later ages, except for among those men with some college. Another benefit of delay in marriage is its contribution to the reduction in the divorce rate. So while divorce is still commonly perceived as an epidemic, many may not realize that the rates have actually been falling, and in fact falling since 1980. And most scholars suggest that declines in the marriage rate, as well as postponing marriage, have played a central role in this. And of course, this stands to reason because obviously people can't get divorced if they aren't married. And it's also commonly believed that marrying at a later age tends to lead to more stable and less risky marriages. And in fact, we do see that marrying at a later age is strongly correlated with being happier in that marriage. Now, that's true up until a point. We see that marriages at a very early age, say those under 20, do tend to be riskier, and very few, only 31%, report being happy. The share reporting that they're happy increases with age at first marriage up through the mid-20s, when fully 66% say that they're happy, then starts to decrease. And again, we're not saying this pattern is entirely causal. We control for a number of other characteristics in the results, but we can't control for everything. But even setting causality aside, just from a descriptive standpoint, these results, I think, are helpful because they just push back a bit on the narrative that you might see these days if you're channel surfing through shows highlighting the lives of 20-somethings. You know, back in my day, it was Sex and the City and Friends. Today, maybe it's Two Broke Girls and the Mindy Project. But at any rate, these results show that marriage in one's mid to late 20s is not a crazy idea or, you know, a doomsday scenario. Next slide, please. Now, what does concern us over these patterns is that parenthood is not being postponed in similar fashion, at least from our vantage point here at the National Campaign. This graph shows us how the median age at first marriage, which is shown by the blue trend line, has been steadily climbing for young adults for quite a few years. Meanwhile, the median age at first birth, which is shown in red, has also been climbing, but much more slowly. And in fact, in 1989, these two milestones crossed over, such that the median age of becoming a parent is now before the average age of getting married. As the age at marriage has receded more quickly than parenthood, we also see a steady increase in the percent of first births outside of marriage. This is shown in the green bars along the bottom, so that nearly 50%, or roughly half of all first births in 2011 were outside of marriage. Now, this crossover isn't exactly breaking news either. As I said, it happened way back in 1989, and it has been widely reported on by a number of other scholars, as noted in the footnote at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. But it's when we broke this trend apart that we found a story that many may not be aware of, and a story that we thought needed to be unpacked a bit further. When we look at it by education, we see that for some, this crossover happened a very long time ago, while for others, it happened only quite recently, and for still others, it hasn't yet happened at all. So in the top panel of this graph, we look first at people with less than a high school diploma. Here we see that even back in 1970, the average age at first birth, which is shown by the circles, was before the average age at first marriage. I'm sorry, average age at first birth is shown by the triangles, and the average age at first marriage is shown by the circles. So even in 1970, this crossover had already occurred, and first births were already happening before first marriages. And the gap has grown even wider since then, especially since the year 2000. This probably won't surprise many of you. The retreat from marriage and shift towards single parenthood has already been widely studied by quite a few scholars with respect to many different disadvantaged populations. So as a result, we see that the percent of first births outside of marriage has risen to 83% by the year 2010. On the flip side, in the middle panel, we look at college graduates. For this population, the crossover has actually never taken place. While these young adults have pushed back marriage to later ages, again shown by the circles, they are pushing back parenthood in similar fashion, shown by the triangles. So both are rising pretty much in lockstep, such that by 2010, their share of first births outside of marriage was just 12%. Finally, in the last graph, we show results for people with either a high school diploma or some college. This is a group in the report that we kind of loosely use as a proxy for middle America. We didn't really call them middle class because I think that tends to be a loaded term. But it's that kind of group in the middle that we think are very important in terms of, I think, kind of a benchmark of how our society is doing. It's this group that has experienced the biggest and most recent transformation. So for this group, parenthood and marriage crossed over, but just since the year 2000. And between 2000 and 2010, we see what suggests to be a widening gap. And among this group in 2010, more than half of first births are now outside of marriage. And again, we think this group is important because when people express concern about the shift towards single parenthood, there tends to be a great deal focused on the most economically disadvantaged populations. But what this highlights is that it's much more moving into the mainstream. And we felt that this part of the story hadn't yet fully been told. Next slide, please. Of course, a lot of the increase in childbearing outside of marriage is playing out among cohabiting couples, and many would argue that those unions aren't a priori bad for children, that there's nothing magic about having that marriage license or that piece of paper, as many would say. And here I'd like to echo Kaye. We certainly recognize that families can either struggle or thrive under many, many different circumstances. And parents do heroic work, whether they're single parents, cohabiting parents, or married parents. What we're presenting here represents outcomes on average. And on average, children born in cohabiting families are at higher risk for a number of adverse outcomes. We're not saying that necessarily owes to cohabitation itself. A good deal of it is probably likely due to the fact that those unions tend to be more fragile and more likely to split up. Um, so when we see here in the top slide that by 5 years after the birth of the child, 39% of children born to cohabiting couples have seen their parents split up, compared to 13% among married parents. Now, instability is not limited to the exit of a parent. In some households, a parent will experience, in fact, multiple transitions in partners. So after the initial partner has left, there could be a series of other partners moving in and out of the household. And again, on average, this does raise the risk of adverse outcomes for children, including outcomes like child abuse. So we see in the bottom chart that, and particularly the bottom chart on the right, that 18% of cohabiting households with children went on to experience multiple relationship transitions. And here we're not counting any transitions to marriage. So among married families, 5% experienced let me back up. Among partners who are married when the child was born, 5% went on to experience multiple relationship transitions. Among cohabiting couples, it was 18%. And among single, never married women who had children, it was 15%. So this instability, again, does put a family at risk for a great deal of hardship. Now, we mentioned this because, again, not to suggest that any particular family structure is good or bad, but we often hear when we talk about the retreat of marriage in response, well, it's not a problem because many of those families are being raised within a cohabiting household. And so we don't need to worry about it. And we felt that that narrative we did need to push back on that narrative a bit. We think that there is source for concern. Even though they may be two-parent households when the child is born, there is still some risk there that we do still need to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So clearly the old sequence that governed the transition into young adult and parenthood has been replaced with something much more complicated. And we're taking a few liberties here. We're having a bit of fun. No doubt, even back in the day, it was never quite that simple, but there was some script and some expectations, whereas now the path goes just about any which way you can imagine. So what about today? Is marriage simply dead? Have we moved past this as an institution and decided that it's some relic of, the Leave It to Beaver era? Next slide, please. And I would say no. There are a lot of different polling data out there, all measuring different opinions, expectations, and aspirations related to marriage. But most suggest that marriage as a family value and as the desired setting for raising kids remains quite strong. And here are just a few examples. In the first chart, we see the percent of high school seniors who say that having a good marriage is extremely important to them. We see for boys and girls, and we see that that has almost barely changed. It really hasn't changed at all since back in the 1970s. We also know that most of them expect to get married someday. 77% for the boys, 85% of the girls. This also is nearly unchanged from the 1970s. So many young people still telling us that marriage is important and definitely something they see in their future. When we go up the age scale a bit and we look at the 25 to 34-year-olds who aren't yet married, most of them say that they do want to get married. Only 5% say that they don't want to get married, and the rest are unsure. But nearly 2/3 say, yes, I do want to get married. And so again, marriage is not an outdated notion. It just seems as though it's getting increasingly complicated to chart a path there. Next slide, please. I think what has changed quite a bit is when young adults plan to get married and what they want to have in place before they do. So in 1976, just 27% of high school seniors expected that it would be 5 or more years before they got married. This rose to 51% in 2014. There are a lot of reasons for this, especially regarding what young adults want to have in place before they say, I do. So to overgeneralize a bit, in the past, many saw marriage as a path toward their future, a way to work toward economic security, a nest egg, a homestead. It was the cornerstone on which everything else was built. Now, as well noted by sociologist Andy Cherlin, or as a well-known sociologist Andy Cherlin would put it, it's more of a capstone. It is the crowning step after all one's other ducks are in a row. After the career is well launched, the money is in the bank, an expensive wedding can be paid for, and perhaps even the home is already purchased. This owes in part to the fact that many young people don't want to get married without an exit strategy, and we see this coming out of a fair bit of qualitative data. They grew up in an age when divorce was more prominent. They've either seen many of their parents or their friends' parents get divorced. And they want to make sure that their life will be okay if their own marriage ends. When viewed in combination with today's economy and with what is arguably one of the worst labor markets in history for young adults, and particularly young adults with less education, those who feel like they need to have economic security nailed down before marriage and economic security nailed down for their partner are probably in for a pretty long wait. Culture also plays a role. There are few social scripts or signposts for young adults these days when it comes to marriage and healthy relationships. Of course, some of the important work that's being done with relationship education is I think, making important efforts to change that. But when you look at pop culture and maybe even conversations around the dinner table, it's not as anchored in the traditional success sequence as it used to be. Finally, it also used to be the case that a significant reason for getting married was to have children. Now, increasingly, parenthood and marriage are disconnected, and those who want to start a family needn't necessarily wait until they find a spouse. This last point is particularly important because it speaks not only to the reasons for delay in marriage, but to the fact that parenthood isn't being delayed in similar fashion, or that crossover that I mentioned earlier. Now, I know I've been speaking for quite a bit. I had meant to take a break for comments or questions earlier, and I failed to do that. I didn't know if there were any burning questions that we wanted to raise now before I moved on.
Kelleen, this is Kathy. If you have a question or a comment, if you'd like to write in your question box, you will see that in your, excuse me, in your control panel, and then I can relay that to Kelleen.
Great.
Just give them a couple of seconds here and see if they've come up with anything. Well.
And of course, we can always go back. So I will move along.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And there's one other reason that we speculate about here at the campaign. I'm sorry, yes. Can you go to the next slide? One other reason that we speculate about here at the campaign about this crossover, ironically, has to do with how much people anticipate and expect to get married. We see here in this graph the percent who expect to marry and who expect to marry their current partner, shown in blue at the bottom. And this was measured among unmarried 18 to 29-year-olds. So in total, 53% who are in a relationship said that they expected to marry their current partner. And even among 18 to 19-year-olds, roughly half said they were with the person that they were going to marry. And of course, we know this expectation isn't borne out in the data. So combine this with the fact that many young adults already struggle mightily to fully protect themselves against pregnancy, and the fact that many do want children someday, and someday not too far off. And we expect that there's a lot of 20-somethings who aren't trying to get pregnant, but aren't really trying that hard to not get pregnant either. And if you wouldn't mind jumping ahead to the next slide. This is a quote that I think illustrates the point quite well. This sort of, well, I'm not really trying to get pregnant. I'm sort of not trying to get pregnant, but maybe not trying that hard. So this came out of a qualitative study of young adults that we did. It's a single woman talking about the pregnancy that she experienced with her former boyfriend. She said, it was like, I trust you, you trust me, we're going to stay together. So it was a part of adult life that we were practicing, but didn't really understand, a false sense of commitment. And the phrase that we heard again and again in this qualitative work with respect to pregnancy was, well, if it happens, it happens. I trust him, he trusts me. So I think if you combine that with the fact that they, again, are expecting to marry their current partner, even though the data tell us they probably won't, that's a recipe for a very high rate of unplanned pregnancy among unmarried 20-somethings, and particularly among the cohabitors. Now, if we could just back up one slide. Here we see those same results for men and women broken out by education. So the left two bars show us these results for men with less than a high school diploma. Among these men, fully 67% expect to marry their current partner, while only 47% of similarly educated young women say the same thing. So a pretty large disconnect here. Many of these women do expect to get married, but not with their current partner. If we look at the middle two bars, we see men and women who have just a high school diploma or GED. Their expectations between men and women are pretty closely aligned. Interestingly, if we look at men and women with at least some college or more, this is the mirror image of those without a high school diploma. So among the men, only 47% expected to marry their current partner. But among the women, it was much, much higher, 67%. So again, another very big disconnect. And we think that we think that these percentages are unrealistically high across the board, but that disconnect adds even more uncertainty to the relationship, and I think kind of opens a wider gap in which unplanned pregnancy is a greater risk. Are there any questions about this slide? I know there's a lot packed in here. Or any other questions that have come up?
Kelleen, I do have one question. It's not about this specific slide, and I'm going to read it to you as it's written. Did anyone talk about the impact of the media and its coverage on extravagant weddings as contributing to the capstone versus cornerstone dichotomy?
I think that's an excellent question. I know when we were doing the report, we were trying to find some solid data on what those trends were and how they factored into a person's delay of marriage, sort of putting off marriage because I can't afford to get married. We found a few data points that supported that, but we couldn't find anything quite as concrete and solid as we wanted to. That being said, we certainly expect that it plays a part in this equation, and definitely when you think about it in terms of a capstone versus a cornerstone. I think I just heard on the news the other day that the average cost of a wedding was in 30,000s. So I think that's pretty daunting by most people's standards. Um, I have to imagine that's a contributing factor, but I don't have really solid data on it.
Okay, thank
Kelleen,
you.
this is Kaye. When I look at this slide, I think that there are assumptions, lots of assumptions going on, especially with college-educated women, assuming that whoever they're with is the guy for them.
Right.
And it reminds me of a story. Oprah Winfrey had a show a couple of years ago. I don't know how she managed this, but she had a very young couple, like they were children, like they were 14 and 15-year-olds who were trying to decide if they were going to have sex. And they had the two kids and their moms and a therapist and Oprah on the stage. And so they took the girl out, and they had just had the boy on the stage, and they said to him, asked him some questions, and one of them was, oh, what do you see the future of this of your little romance here? Or they asked the girl first. Then and the boy wasn't listening to this. They said, what do you see the future of your romance? And she says, oh, he's it. He's mine. This is it. True love. We're going to be together forever. And then they traded places, and they had the guy on stage, and they said to him, what do you see the future of this relationship? And he said, 6 months.
Right.
And the little girl, somehow, this was just related to me in a story, but the little girl, hearing this, of course, was crushed,
yeah.
but had never thought, had just been living in her own little world of assumptions. So that strikes me as if it's what we call in the Dibble world, sliding, not deciding. If you're in college and you think he's the one, but you've never asked him.
Right.
If he thinks he's the one, then that's that gap, right? That's the 20%. I guess, if you looked at this, you would think, well, 47%, they might have a chance because they both see a future together.
Exactly.
But the scary part is the girls, the young ladies who, the 20% who don't see, who see a future together, and their boyfriends don't.
Right.
So, is that your analysis of this? That there's some amount of like you said, wishful thinking, magical thinking that I'm sure it's right. I'm in love. It'll be, we have a future together.
Yeah, I'm actually concerned about. If we're looking at the women, and for example, I'm concerned about the whole 67% or most of the 67% because odds are. I'm concerned about all of the 47 and 67% because I think even when they're on the same page, many of them probably have unrealistic expectations. But I'm especially concerned about the extra 20% that you were mentioning. I think that disconnect in expectations is huge. And I'm a huge fan of the phrase, Scott Stanley's sliding, not deciding. And it applies not only to relationships, but to parenthood as well. And I didn't include a lot in this presentation because I felt it was a bit off topic, but there is a huge amount of ambivalence when it comes to family formation and pregnancy. So in some survey work that we did, we asked young men and women whether it was very important to them to avoid pregnancy right now, and a great many of them said yes. Later in the survey, we said, would you be a little bit happy if you got pregnant right now? And a great many of them also said yes. So there's a huge push-pull when it comes to parenthood, combined with the fact that most contraceptive methods require a fair bit of effort on the part of the user. And what we see then is a lot of people just kind of falling into parenthood, not really trying to get pregnant, but like I said, not trying that hard to not get pregnant. And so they're sliding into parenthood just like they're sliding into relationships. And in fact, I know we used to talk a lot about shotgun marriages. Now we're talking increasingly about shotgun cohabitations. Dan Lichter has been writing quite a bit about that. So there's a lot of, it's very messy in the early 20s and mid 20s.
And the irony, of course, as you showed earlier, those slides, that the bulk of young people when they're 18, seniors in high school, like 80-some% of young ladies and 70-some% of young guys say they think marriage and family life is really important for them. But then they do have this disconnect, like, however I live, however I raise my children, it's okay. If I had children, that would be okay too.
Right. It's very difficult to align intentions with outcomes and behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
It's a constant challenge.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we can move on, and we can skip past this.
Okay.
So what do we do about this? And of course, in the report, we raise a lot more questions than we do answers. I think primarily, if there were easy answers, we wouldn't be here talking about it. So our goal really was just to elevate this issue, elevate this story, and we hope to be kind of more of a catalyst for some more national dialogue on this. Obviously, we think that the educational work that's being done within couples in the area of healthy relationship building is really important. But just like our world in teen pregnancy prevention, we expect the solutions are going to need to go beyond the classroom as well, especially if we believe in this capstone versus cornerstone narrative. So we've teed up quite a few questions in the report. Certainly our intent wasn't to go through all of them today, but we think economic and educational policy is going to be really important. Honestly, to me, it's not clear whether the answer lies in making post-secondary ed affordable to everybody or creating a more promising labor market trajectory that's outside of post-secondary ed. It's probably needs to be a combination of both. And we can, if folks want to have some discussion about that, that's great. With respect to family policy, there's always, whenever we talk about supporting opportunities for marriage, I think there's always conversation about the need to revamp some of our assistance policies, some of our economic assistance policies and those supports in place for families. But what we wanted to push on, again, through our lens here at the campaign, was to say, when we talk about supporting families, let's not just talk about the families that have already been started. Let's also talk about, helping families means helping young adults decide when to start families and helping them line up their intentions and their outcomes a little bit better. So we felt it was very important to make that point, and it's surprisingly difficult to get policymakers to sort of swim upstream. So we wanted to, I think, make that really a very important piece of this. And then when we talk about culture, we just wanted to sort of raise this interesting question. We know that some of the outcomes we care about the most are to some extent driven by and to some extent reflecting of social messages and social norms. And we know that's true in the area of teen pregnancy. We wonder to what extent this is playing out with respect to relationship culture as well, and whether people think, again, when you look at pop media, is that media simply reflecting the way it is, or is that media helping to shape what these trends are? So lots of questions people can think about if they like. Like we offer some additional thoughts, our take on some of this in the report.
And the report is in everyone. If you look at your control panel, we've uploaded the report from the campaign. It's a PDF, and it's a great document that goes in, as Kelleen said, goes into lots more detail than we were able to today. We want to open this up to questions, and as I do, if you have thoughts, you who are listening, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on these questions that the campaign has raised. Like, how does economic and educational, what do you think about affecting educational and economic policy? Or what do you think about family policies? How can we align family policies to support not only current families, but not yet formed families, and how can we make those stronger? And then finally, to the question one of our participants had about, the glamour weddings, which everybody wants, but I can't possibly afford. So there's all those questions about how we talk about family and commitment and family formation. I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts out there on these questions that the campaign has posed.
And Kelleen, we have a question.
Yeah.
If you'd like to answer. The question is, are you including LGBT people in this data? And if so, are any of the conclusions complicated or different for LGBT populations?
That's an excellent question. The LGBT youth are not in these data. Their outcomes and their opportunities for relationships and families are very important. We felt that the factors surrounding their opportunities were quite different, and especially as it intersects with parenthood. The unplanned pregnancy, that tends to be a very serious concern of ours here at the campaign, and this notion of kind of accidentally sliding into parenthood does not play out in the same way for the LGBT community. Certainly there are many young adults who decide that they want to form a lasting and loving relationship and raise children, but it's a very different dynamic. They, I think, by contrast, are often very committed and very dedicated and very intentional for a whole variety of reasons. It's also the case that in the data that we looked at, there was not a large enough sample of LGBT youth to study and come to any, I think, really reliable conclusions about. But I think primarily it's because they face a very different set of circumstances. So it's not to say that their outcomes and opportunities aren't equally important, but I think just very different.
Okay, and the other question, which was part of this, was this data collected prior to the Defense of Marriage Act being overturned by the Supreme Court?
Yes. So we draw on a variety of data sources. That includes the National Survey of Family Growth, the Current Population Survey, but I would say off the top of my head that yes, they all preceded that.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I was at the CDC a few years ago and making some, obviously unfounded remarks about, gay and lesbian youth and pregnancy rates, and maybe we didn't have to be as concerned. And the nice folks at the CDC informed me that actually on a percent, and maybe you can confirm this, Kelleen, as a percentage of the population, young lesbians have a higher rate of pregnancy than straight young ladies, young gals. Is that your understanding?
I don't have those statistics at my fingertips, but I do know that yes, they do tend to be a high-risk group. I think especially for teen pregnancy. So I think that's a very important point to make.
Yeah, it amazes me how when I'm in a group, this is Kaye speaking, when I'm in a group talking to policymakers or others, or people actually working with youth, especially at-risk youth, and they'll say, well, these young people, they don't really need to think about their relationships. That really, how you form your family, really, and these are all people who often are married themselves.
Right.
So
right.
I find it ironic that we somehow, you start with a statistic. What anchors me in my work is knowing that most young people, 70 to 80% of teenagers and 2/3 of young adults really want a stable form of family life and even to be married. And now that everyone can be married, let's all come to the party. This is, everybody jump in the pool. But somehow we somehow then say, well, but those young people, they don't really want it. They've had too much of a traumatic childhood, or they've had too much, whatever it is, and we don't give them a chance. In the positive youth development world, we aren't giving them the chance to actually make that choice. We kind of like pre-screen and say, well, we're not going to talk about that because so.
Right. I think we do need to hear more from young people, and we need to understand what they want. So we felt that there was this narrative that first, young people don't even want this, and we thought, well, I don't know if that's entirely true. Some young people, this may be part of their aspirations, and other people it may not, but we need to hear from them what their goals and aspirations are, and then we need to hear what are the barriers that they face. And I'm sure it's some combination of economic barriers, cultural barriers, up until very recently, and in some cases still the case, there are legal barriers. And we need to, I think as a society, we put out this message that if you're going to start a family, generally we think a two-parent family may have, we think that can be a good environment for raising kids. It's not the only good environment, but it's one good environment. If we're promoting that as a society, then we need to think about ways to support that for any young adult who wants to get married.
Yeah, and as you say, there's this interesting dance between the economic side and then this relational side that, it's really clear, and they've studied this for years, that if you have a stable income and you're able to make a living, you're able to support a family, it's easier to say, yes, let's get married, than if you're like right now, what percentage of young people are still living with their parents? Young women into their 30s are living with their parents because of the debt of the debts they may have, or just the job prospects. And so it's really hard to think about like going off on your own if you don't have a stable economic base to build on.
Exactly, and it can get very daunting to even take on the conversation, because when you start to go down that road, you just hit endless numbers of complexity. So making college more affordable is a wonderful goal on the surface, but it gets very complicated then to decide how that's going to happen.
Right.
Others have talked about, well, we should make college more pragmatic. We should focus more on how to align and make sure people have a more realistic assessment of what is the cost of the degree, what are the future job prospects. But then there are a lot of countervailing arguments that sort of push against that as well. There really are no easy answers. So,
yeah, like you said, if it were easy, we would have fixed this.
Exactly.
By noon
but
today.
certainly, I think hearing from the young people themselves is an important place to start, and having policymakers focus on more about this. And I think understanding that, we go through this in the world of teen pregnancy prevention as well, trying to work across sectors. So our issues should matter to those who care about high school graduation, and those who care about housing, and those who care about economic mobility, and those who care about child well-being. But it's hard to get all these different sectors to make those connections.
Right. Here's an interesting comment. I think it's really just about supporting, this is from one of our participants, and thank you for writing. I think it's about supporting people with whatever decisions they make, to become parents, to get married, to not get married, without stigma. I don't think that necessarily just pushing people towards marriage as an ideal relationship structure is the answer. And especially for a lot of women who are in societies in which divorce or out-of-wedlock divorce are highly stigmatized, it can become difficult to escape relationships that are damaging or abusive. So for me, it's really about acknowledging that families take many different forms, and all people need support to raise healthy families. And I would say, of course, all families do need support to raise healthy families, or have healthy families. But I would also say, back to my initial comment about the research, is, it is more, you can look at the outcomes of children who come from married families, those who come from non-married families. You can Google bad things dads do, and you can Google bad things boyfriends do. 2/3 of all child abuse happens when there's non-related males in the house. There's lots of data now on adverse childhood experiences that shows that, children exposed to relationship turbulence in their early years, it's really hard on them as their brain, as their neural pathways are being completed. And we know, I think what this questioner and I have in common is we know that parents want to do the absolute best by their children, absolutely. And sometimes we don't give them enough information to make a really informed decision. And I'll give you an example. One of our programs was taught to single moms in the TANF in California. We call it CalWorks, the old welfare system. And this young mom was reported back to her instructor. She said, I was sitting at the bus stop one day in Sacramento, California. A guy drove past, rolled down his window, and said, hey, baby, what's your phone? And she said, before I learned relationship skills, before I understood how relationships grow and develop, before I understood healthy relationships, before I understood what my children need in terms of my relationships, she said, I would have gotten in the car with him.
Mm-hmm.
A young mother getting into a car of a stranger.
Right.
And
I think for us, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So she said, after I took this class, I understood that he didn't know my name and he didn't know anything about me. So that woman didn't get a message about marriage. Okay, that's fair. What she got a message about was, how do I keep my child safe? What do I look for in a healthy relationship? And, Kelleen, what did we just prevent? We might have prevented an unplanned pregnancy. We might have prevented an abusive relationship. We might have prevented more child support. We might have prevented some kid from going into the child welfare system. So to our the person who made that comment, yeah, we don't need to force people in. They need to make their own choices, but they really need to be informed choices. And currently, we're not getting a lot of information out to young people about what are the consequences of their various kind of the decisions they make around how to form their family.
Right. And I would add, too, especially through the lens that we bring here at the campaign, is that our message isn't that, to dictate when and under what circumstances people should start their families, but it's about intentionality. So many of these unplanned pregnancies, they are unplanned, unintentional pregnancies. They are pregnancies that the women themselves said, no, this wasn't really what I had intended. And so it's more to say, what do you want for your own future?
Exactly.
What do you want in terms of your employment trajectory or in terms of your education, and what is the best sequencing then of that and your relationship formation and parenthood? And how do we support young adults in they can decide what that sequence is that they want, but how can we support them in putting that sequence in place and being more intentional about it?
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Well, we're in heated agreement here. We have one more little question, and the answer is I don't know. So if this were Jeopardy, the answer is I don't know, and the question is, do we have data on how many high school students marry their high school sweethearts?
That's a fascinating question that I don't know the answer to either. It might depend on sort of how far we follow them out of high school. I would have to look into that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. We do know that there's, I come from a long family, except everybody but me, who married the first person they ever dated.
Yeah.
But I don't know how true that is anymore. So
I would suspect it's not very common, but I don't have the data in front of me.
Well, thank you, Kelleen. This was a really great panel, and I've gotten some comments about that. So we appreciate that. We give credit to all these authors who helped make this happen quite across the board, and credit to the campaign for bringing everybody together. And you can see.
I just want to say I really appreciate everybody's questions.
Yeah, that was great. And then we have notyet.org. Let's see. Wrong way. Notyet.org will get you to the website where there's more data on this, so you can share it with your colleagues. We've already done the question part, but there's Kelleen's email if you want to contact her directly, kkk@nc.org. And thank you. We're going to send you a little survey so you can help us think about topics for the future, how well this worked for you, give us some feedback. And we will also be archiving this webinar so you can pass it along to others. Next month in December, we're going to be having our gift to you. Our gift to you is a month off from webinars. But seriously, we've put on 11 great webinars this year. And so we, in December, let people go back to our archives and pick one that they didn't get to review. So at your own time, at your own pace, please take a look at our archived webinars and pick one that you like to listen to. And in the meantime, if you're not part of our newsletter, please go to dibblesinstitute.org and you can join our newsletter, join our learning community. We're part of the modern world, so we're on Facebook and LinkedIn. That's my email address. And Kathy is at the end of that 800 number. So there's lots of ways to contact us. There, I got ahead of myself. So there's our gift to you. You can go to our archives and look for the archive of your choice. So thank you so much. We've run a little bit over, but Kelleen, appreciate you and all that you did to make this happen. Kathy, thank you for being a great engineer. And for the rest of you, have a happy holiday season and a great new year. And we'll see you back in January. Thanks so much.